welcome to Craft Conversations. So do you want to start out by introducing yourself for us?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Faune Ybarra. I am a diasporic artist from Mexico City, Oaxaca, but I lived in Newfoundland as well as BC. I say I'm a diasporic artist because I regard the context of my practice rather than the medium. So I work mostly in time-based media, and I really like it allows you to regard and pay more attention to the process rather than the final product. By time-based media, I mean anything from video to performance to sound to installation. And of course, I've been incorporating skills that I learned both at Memorial University of Newfoundland, where I studied my undergrad, as well as things that my mother passed me down, like sewing and mending clothes and making flower arrangements. I use time-based media because there's this regard to the time and the process, but I really don't stay with one medium in particular. I like to think of myself as a storyteller.
One of the things that I've heard from artists so many times is they've started with one way of approaching the storytelling, and then kind of as they learn, as they grow, they bring in all these other ways of doing that same thing. You're building your art practice, but it's not necessarily bound to one specific, I'm a painter.
During the pandemic as well, I remember the very, very long lines. I went to Michael's, but of course, anything you could think of, paint or brushes or canvases or stuff like that, all of those were taken. I think people were really trying to have little side projects to keep sanity. I came across this thinking of you stamp and some gift paper. I just followed my intuition, I guess, at that point of what happens when we stamp. I'm imprinting this thing that says thinking of you, and who am I thinking of? And I think it was at the time it was a reflection of thinking of the people that I couldn't be with, my mom, my friends in Newfoundland, people in Mexico City, my dad, even people living in Vancouver. I there was no way to connect with them at that point. I mean, during the initial shutdown, and kind of calling to those memories of, okay, maybe I'm not just thinking about my mom that I cannot see. I'm thinking about all the people that I cannot see at this point, I've never seen. And I don't know why, but it all reflects back to either my grandmother, my mom's mom, or my dad's mom. And then I joined them all together, all these pieces of paper. I use a chain stick that is one of the basic stitches that my mom taught me. And I created this strip of paper, just saying thinking of you. And I went to a railroad in Vancouver in 6th Avenue that used to connect Olympic Village to Granville Island. And I just let it fly. I was just playing with that and my body and sort of collaborating with the wind. In my case, standing there with this piece of paper, trying to connect all the people that I never met, the people that I couldn't see at the time, and sort of an offering of this is who I am, this is where I am, this is who I'm thinking of, and just trying to stitch all these stories together. So that was the initial process, and then instead of the gift craft paper that I got before, now it was washi paper, which I think also in material terms speak to the diaspora in Vancouver. This Japanese paper is traditionally used to build lamps. We imprinted it with this thinking of you stamps, and we used my body as a support structure to articulate what I will later stitch together and glue together to form an iceberg. And you can see that, it's a bedroom. That's my bedroom. It can get in the way sometimes when you're trying to clean, but at the same time, it's quite a blessing to go to bed and seeing the final piece. It doesn't get more intimate than that. this iceberg sculpture. Later, that became also part of this project, the Archive of Embodied Displacement. This is my own archive. These are my own stories. And it really came from thinking about ghosts, like ghost stories, like the absence of something, of someone. I began reflecting of like, where's my archive? Where is a place I can go to and find the stories of the people who brought me here? Where's the archive of the diasporic people? Do we have to go back to the places we're from to find our stories? Or can we start making our own stories and, to archive, to like house something, have our own means of creating these stories of storytelling? I was reflecting about like icebergs, because I found this image on a book that's called Through Newfoundland with the Camera by Robert Edward Holloway. There's a lot of depictions of St. John's and what we now know as Newfoundland. And I just couldn't take my eyes off this image of an iceberg in the Narrows of St. John's. Whoever saw that iceberg, the iceberg is probably not longer here, but we keep seeing it because it became water. It became part of the sea. The sea became rain. It was a cloud. We see it in the fog. It's all around us. And with that reflection of water, I started thinking of the absence of my grandmother. As I said, I've never met her. We don't have any documents with photos of her. I haven't seen my grandmother. I don't know how she looked like. I just know that my mom looks like my grandmother, and I look a little bit like my mom. So every time I see myself in the mirror, in a way, I'm also seeing my grandmother, but I've never saw her. So I have to believe that my grandmother is around me, just like water, just like rain, just like going to a river and knowing it will become part of the sea. So like through thinking that, I was just like, hey, like let's tell a story of like a nicer unbecoming. And it became like this opportunity of performing with like one of my bed sheets. It was pandemic time, so of course you had to like use whatever you had at that moment, and then just started performing like in front of the projector, projecting this image of an iceberg and moving and creating different forms. My way of seeing it is that I'm becoming and unbecoming this iceberg and becoming and unbecoming all these stories of both diasporic people, while also questioning the case, who got to document Newfoundland, who got to document my family. One of the iterations of that piece, Maria Filipina from the Richmond Art Gallery reached out to me, and she said like, hey, I watched your performance on Vimeo. I'll be interested in like doing another iteration of the piece where like you shot these different poses or moments in the performance where you're becoming and unbecoming the iceberg. And it became part of Capture Photo Fest in Vancouver. It's now at Aberdeen Station. Richmond, of course, like with having so many diasporic folks living there, it just became this opportunity to connect further with those stories of alienation, belonging, trying to be, but not quite wanting to be there, having some maybe barriers there. I wanted to like use my body to tell this story. I think my body takes like a different political meaning even. Why am I here? Why someone who wasn't born here is now in so-called Canada? Seeing my body as a political tool, you have to rethink your role in this state nation where I am legally a temporary resident of so-called Canada. And there are a lot of implications with that, from funding I cannot access to jobs, a lot of other things that I do not have access, even though I've been living in Canada for like the past 9 years. So I'm legally a temporary resident, but I'm also an uninvited guest to Indigenous lands. Like those are two different axes. I see some folks kind of leaning towards the like, oh, I'm a temporary resident, and like, I have all these things that do not help like being here. And of course that is a reality, but there also needs to be some solidarity with Indigenous folks, with Black folks that are also part of this land. I moved to Canada in 2015, which is when like all this act that now seems very performative of reconciliation started happening. So even before being in Canada, there was no awareness from my side of things of the people that have been displaced, the people that we keep extracting from. But now that, curriculums have changed, universities have tried to like indigenize the curriculum, whatever that means. But at the very least, there's more awareness as to like who are the stewards of the land. So my body as a political tool is sort of like this opportunity to start this conversation and like situating myself. And sure, I legally I'm something, but I'm also not invited guest. And what does that mean then? To invite these stories to my body and like use my body as a way to create what I'm trying to like story tell.
Something I wanted to ask you about is when we were talking about the different things that you wanted to talk about today, is you mentioned like family and immigration and storytelling and diaspora. And so one of the things I was really curious about is like what inspired these four things to kind of come together as one topic for you?
Yeah, my mom has definitely been the inspiration for a lot of my practice. Like I acquired from her like aesthetic values as well as like nurturing habits of seeing what's around me, creating and sort of adapting it to the space, like my environment, how I live. My mom used to make like, or still makes her own like curtains, bedding, and stuff like that. And the one that has like green plants and then like a lamp. You can also see Paul McCartney. But yeah, well, these are some of the latest projects by my mom. All the things that my mom did, I didn't necessarily see them as like an inspiration for my practice when I was in undergrad. I think there has been a big jump of like immigrating to Canada, like at first to Newfoundland in Pornbrook to do my undergrad, and then right after go to my master's across the country to Vancouver. So I think, I mean, you know, there's different lived experiences of going through academia, but definitely coming from a family that didn't necessarily go to school after like finishing high school, or that did go but never finish their degree, and having my mom's mom, like my grandmother that I never met, that never learned how to read or write. There's a lot of contrasts in my story of having to like learn a new language, going to Canada, going to like a country that has systemically like being present in what we call the global south in more of an extractivist practice of resources, and then going there, learning a new language, learning my own visual language, and sort of filtering my own stories to fit in like an academic context, to not talk from my feelings, to talk from a place of I read this person who's a whole European canon, and then justifying my projects from those lenses. Now that I'm a temporary resident to so-called Canada, that I've been like a year or so out of these academic settings, I started reflecting on like what really inspired me to become an artist. It didn't come from like lectures of art history where they repeat endlessly who are like the masterminds of art. It had nothing to do with that. My inspiration comes from my mother and like my grandmother, who did what they have to do to raise all their kids, and being resourceful, storytelling and like diaspora and like familial relationships sort of like come together to be like part of my practice, but also as a way for me to like give back to those spaces and like provide moments of or spaces rather where like folks could come together and explore together. What does it mean to create in like a collaborative context, in like a community context? That was like a workshop that I had at the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver. All materials were provided, and I repeated the same workshop. This happened at Whole Fest, which is a contemporary art festival that is hosted by Eastern Edge Gallery, and we just did some flower pounding, which is basically just like having wonderful flowers that are very pigmented and putting them in between like something that is hard, like a hard surface. Then you have the flower, then you put like a fabric that has been pre-treated to receive the pigments better, and then just pounding away with the hammer until like all the pigments come forward. And that action of imprinting, of collecting flowers, of like shopping for flowers is definitely something that I got from my mom. Like this action of like, let's just do something together is, I don't know, I just find it so powerful as well. We did like a collaborative blanket where we all put a little bit of ourselves. We experimented with different plants. We have very pigmented results, but we also have more transparent, like kind of ghost flowers going on in there.
I think I love too what you said, like almost like the ghosts of flowers. One of the things I love about thinking about memory too is the extent to which that like memories change over time too. And so, you know, as you make that memory of a flower, it's different in that memory than it was in the beginning, and kind of having those fading, almost like fading ones, I guess. Yeah.
Oh my God, I love this. And to think of the past is like to tell the stories to ourselves, because there's no way for us to travel back in time and relive things as we live them. It was a seminar by Veronica Gerber-Bisecci. She says that, if we were to look back to old notebooks, old artworks, we will find like pieces or questions that we are still exploring today. So whenever I like approach a new artwork and I realize that it's actually an iteration of something that I've already done, it gives me hope to know that there's a way to look into the future and to find myself in that future. And with that kind of elongated the life of like my grandmother that I've never got to meet, of like ancestors that I don't know of, because there's a lot of silence in my family about those stories. So yeah, I think like the act of looking back is like a commitment to the future.
Gets at what we were talking about earlier too, where we're talking about, how we're talking about gestures. It's almost like the activity in itself rather than like the outcome. Is that right?
I say that my projects are mostly diasporic gestures, because I like to think of gestures as ways of asserting yourself somewhere. Where I come from, seeing my mother do all these things for the places she inhabited and keeps inhabiting, and then also coming from Mexico City and Oaxaca, specifically Oaxaca, where there's this whole history of graphic art and political art, like where art is a means of expressing political views, as opposed to like quite the opposite. Like we are not like making like graffiti to like make streets pretty or like to welcome tourists. It just says like what it says there. And it's really like a reflection of what's happening with like gentrification of Oaxaca, and of course Mexico City as well. People, I know it's more common, I guess, that they are from the States or from any other country that like the exchange rate favors them, and then they come to our cities, they come to the places we live. The cost of life just goes higher and higher because like we don't earn in those dollars. So like art is a way to express those, like it's not just a little like sweet thing that is hanging on the wall, but there's story behind it. There's feelings, there's anger, there's hope. I found that in dandelions, like a powerful metaphor for diasporic people. Like dandelions, diasporic people iterate, they move, they, become and unbecome. The seeds spread, we grow at the margin sometimes. This changing nature, like this iterative nature of a dandelion. Like I started collecting dandelions from like the edges of the street. I made some dandelion jam with the purpose of having a different way of archiving these stories. If we think of dandelion seed as like diasporic stories, then making dandelion jam maybe it's a way to like house those stories. And I really like the idea of like spreading then the jam of the dandelion and a piece of toast and eating it, and then it's an archive that passes through you, that incorporates the body in that process. And I found, I know, like hope in that gesture, like another diasporic gesture.
So you have like your storage of different preserved dandelions that you can then pull out later and look at.
The process of like turning them into dandelion jam. There's little stories that I'm incorporating, skills that I'm bringing that are not just mine, that are from my family, that are from my friends, that are this opportunity to like come together and enjoy a piece of toast with like a friend and tea. They lend themselves to be more welcoming of other stories as well. If I ever hear someone saying like, oh, like I think dandelions might not be the best way to compare diasporic people to, because this and that, is like, oh, that's wonderful, like let's talk about it. Like there's no ego in that. There's no like, this is my project and your voice doesn't matter. It's like, this is what I did. What do you think of it? I will collect maple leaves, representative in like an iconographic level of so-called Canada. And then I brought some of them back to my house in Mexico City. I went to my childhood park and I sewed the maple leaves to a ficus, which is like a tree that is very common in Mexico City. At the time, I was thinking like how a maple leaf from Cornbrook and a ficus from Mexico City, what are the stories that we are telling with the landscape? Where's the agency of that land? And especially, again, being political, like knowing that there has has been displacement, that, you know, in like the history of Newfoundland, there's been whole communities resettled. The story that the landscape tells for me is far more interesting than what we say the landscape has done. Like being outside and like listening to elders, finding solidarity with other folks that have also been displaced, historically displaced, or refugees, other immigrants. They also tell the story of a landscape, but they don't tell it from a place of we conquered. It's more of like a place of we lost, and despite that loss, there's something. There's stories to be shared.